An MI6 agent, a CIA agent, and a KGB agent are all arguing about which agency is the best at catching spies. The UN Secretary General overhears this conversation. He decides to put them to the test. He releases a rabbit out into the forest and tells each agency to go seek out and find the rabbit. MI6 goes into the forest first. After 3 months of interrogating their informants, both animal and mineral, they come out of the forest and declare that there is no rabbit. The CIA goes into the forest, and after a month of looking around in the forest and not finding the rabbit, in frustration, they burn down the whole forest, killing almost everything in the forest, including the rabbit. The KGB goes in last, and after looking around for an extensive period of time, they're found coming out of the forest with a bear on a leash. The bear is smoldering from the fire, and he's been beaten badly by the KGB agents. The bear says, okay, I admit it, I'm a rabbit. Setting aside all dad jokes, and I apologize for that, but I couldn't help myself. Let's talk about The Spy and the Traitor by Ben MacIntyre. It's an excellent book. It covers the Cold War, and specifically the KGB agent who provided information and turned double agent to British intelligence. First, some background on the Cold War. The Cold War started immediately after the conclusion of World War II and essentially lasted until November 9th of 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. Personally, I was alive during that whole time. I was both a child and a teenager and a young man during the Cold War. And from my personal experience, the Cold War was kind of scary at times. I can recall bomb drills where we were supposed to duck and cover under our desks, simulating a nuclear strike on our country. The interesting thing about that is I lived in a small town of approximately 1,500 people. We were nowhere near what you would probably consider a target for a nuclear strike by the Soviets. Notwithstanding, we're preparing for that eventuality. But the reality of the situation is essentially you live your life. The threat of nuclear war is always present. It became very real during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was before I was born. But essentially you lived your life. But it's that context, the context of the Cold War, where we, the United States, were radically pitted against the evil empire, as we describe them, the USSR. It's in that context that this book is written. Let me tell you about Oleg Gordievsky. He's the subject of this book. Gordievsky was a KGB agent. His father was an agent of the NKVD, which was the predecessor to the KGB. Gordievsky's wife, also a KGB agent. Gordievsky had been stationed in both Denmark and the United Kingdom. MacIntyre presents Gordievsky in what I would describe as a somewhat one-dimensional way. Why do I say that? Well, one, the sole motivation for Gordievsky approaching British intelligence and offering to spy on their behalf was that Gordievsky was disillusioned with the USSR. I don't know, maybe that was the motivation, the sole motivation. But notwithstanding, Gordievsky is presented as an honest man, a dutiful man, with the exception of spying for British intelligence. MacIntyre does an excellent job of letting the man's deeds speak for themselves. And he also does a phenomenal job of presenting Spycraft to the reader. How you handle a spy, which is very important. How do you keep a spy happy who's concerned about his life, the life of his wife and children? If you're that British agent that's handling Gordievsky, how do you manage that? You also presented our tradecraft, dead drops, brush passes, cutouts, and extractions. All these things are very important in the spy world, and you're going to learn a lot about it if you read this book, which I do recommend that you do. And I'm not going to give you any spoilers here, even though essentially all of this is history, with the exception of the actual Gordievsky story, but I can give you some context around that, which is also presented in the book because it's natural history that's available to all of us. And I'll do that in a moment. But first, I want to tell you that the action presented in the book is thrilling. It's exhilarating. The pace is fast. You're not going to be bored by reading this. This is not boring history. This is real. It's dangerous. And the book reads easy and remains at heart a scholarly work. There are references to provide the source materials that MacIntyre relied upon in writing this book. So this is not like History Channel history where, the History Channel finds some obscure PhD from a college you've never heard of who comes up with a crackpot theory, and he leads off with phrases like, some might argue, some people say. Well, that's not history and that's not backed up. It's just a fringe theory. MacIntyre does a phenomenal job of backing up the information that he provides. MacIntyre writes this book having interviewed Gordievsky himself several times. And he's honest about the difficulty of writing a history because Spycraft is notoriously difficult to write about accurately. And that's because there's a lot of misinformation in Spycraft, and it's difficult to parse through what is true and what is not true, what is misinformation. And also there's a built-in bias, right? Personal motivations are hard to suss out because there's a tendency to justify one's own actions. And that can include Gordievsky. So why is this book important? Well, I'll give you an example that's presented in the book. In 1983, the rhetoric between the United States and the Soviet Union was very, very heated. President Reagan himself promised to leave Marxism in the ash heap of history, which if you're Soviet, you could probably consider rightfully as a threat. And in 1983, the USA intentionally entered into Soviet airspace with our fighter jets. The interesting thing there is that the Soviet Union failed to scramble its own fighter jets in response. And this led to a rather heated response from Soviet leadership. That was not going to happen again. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, a Korean airliners, a civilian aircraft, inadvertently entered into Soviet airspace just north of Japan and was shot down by a Soviet fighter. That heightened the tensions radically. The Soviets were very concerned that the USA was preparing for a first nuclear strike. When I read that the Soviet Union leadership was very, very worried that the United States itself was going to attack the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons, I'm kind of shocked by that, because growing up during the Cold War, we always thought that, hey, we're the good guys. And the Soviets are clearly the bad guys. And frankly, they were. They were doing a lot of really bad things with their own people and others in other countries. But we're the good guys. And so they would know that about us, right? And therefore, how could they possibly conclude that we, the United States, would enter into a first strike? Well, this book presents the leadership in the Soviet Union as being very afraid. And we know that because Gordievsky was providing that information. So Soviet leadership tasked KGB agents throughout the world, including Gordievsky, with finding information to verify and validate their conclusion that the USA was preparing for a first strike. And unfortunately, what happened, it's confirmation bias. KGB agents that came back and saying, we can find no information of that. We don't believe it's true. They were chastised. And in contrast, KGB agents that were coming back and saying, oh yeah, clearly the evidence is that the USA is preparing for a first strike, they were rewarded. So Gordievsky is in the middle of all of this while he's stationed in the UK. Shortly following upon the Soviet efforts to try to find out the United States is preparing a first strike, the United States engaged in a naval operation, a war game, if you will, called Able Archer. The goal behind Able Archer was to simulate an escalating conflict with the Soviet Union that would ultimately result in the Soviet Union preparing for a first strike. And unfortunately, the Soviets did not see Able Archer as a war exercise. They thought it was real. And because they thought it was real, they were preparing for a preemptive nuclear strike. They actually loaded bombers with nuclear weapons and prepared them for takeoff. That's how close we came. Gordievsky is vital here because he provided information to British intelligence and told them that this is the Soviet concern. They're afraid of the United States. They're afraid of the United States preparing for a first strike. MI6, British intelligence, provided that information to the CIA, and the striking thing is it never found its way to President Reagan. Notwithstanding, Gordievsky remains pivotal because ultimately that information did get to President Reagan, and as a result of that information, President Reagan de-escalated the rhetoric against the Soviet Union and actually reached out to them to engage in arms talks to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. I had no idea that when President Reagan was reaching out to the Soviets to actually discuss entering into a treaty to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, that it was because of Gordievsky that he was doing that. It's striking, and this book is vital in giving you that backstory. That's the importance of the novel. And so I recommend that you read The Spy and the Traitor by Ben MacIntyre. Once again, it's very well written. It's more of a thriller than anything, but it's an excellent historical document because it contains references. It essentially gives to you what Gordievsky was saying about his spycraft as a KGB agent and about what information he was providing to the UK that could be used in essentially averting nuclear holocaust for all of us. Gordievsky himself was a cooling balm of hard fact in a time of suspicion. And so I'm going to recommend that you read this. The threat of nuclear war certainly hasn't gone away. Russia and ourselves and several of our allies, Pakistan and India, all have nuclear weapons. And so it's important that we understand that having good intelligence and rational leadership is vital in averting nuclear war. This book provides excellent example of that we can learn from and that we can use to our betterment as we go forward. And so we come full circle back to the title, The Spy and the Traitor. The spy, obviously, is Gordievsky. Who's the traitor? During this novel, we learn about Aldrich Ames, who was an American CIA agent who provided information to the KGB that ultimately resulted in the execution of many of our informants in the Soviet Union. Ames was convicted of treason, and he's still in prison today. Is he the traitor? Or is the reference to the traitor in the title about Gordievsky? And that's an interesting question. Is a man who provides information against his own country when he's righteously motivated by the rottenness and the corruption in his own government, is that man a traitor? Well, flip it around. If in our own country or your own country you had such an individual that provided information, you would probably still consider that man a traitor. But notwithstanding, Gordievsky risked all. He lost his position at KGB. He lost his wife and children. And he did all of this to provide information to the West. And he should be lauded on that basis alone. And so I think that you should read the book simply so you know about Oleg Gordievsky, the man who helped prevent nuclear war in our time of need. Once again, this is Bookies. I'm rating The Spy and the Traitor 4.25. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. I mean, it takes a lot of work to produce these videos, and I love it when I can see that people are engaging with the material, and it makes me feel real good. So have a great day. God bless.